I just wanted to welcome everybody here. It's great to have this diverse audience. And the talk is really divided into three sections. The first, we're going to discuss unconventional gas extraction and how that differs from conventional gas extraction. And then we're going to move on to talk about some of the potential environmental contamination, potential human exposures, and potential health effects from unconventional gas extraction. I may just start calling it gas drilling because it's so hard to say unconventional gas extraction activities over and over again. And then we're going to discuss the potential for social disruption and for mental health effects. Now, in conventional gas extraction, you have a vertical well that is tapping a defined reservoir of natural gas. And this type of drilling or gas extraction would not work in the Marcellus Shale. The Marcellus Shale is a 100 to 200 foot wide, relatively impermeable geological formation in which there is gas trapped within small fissures throughout the shale. So there's not a single pool of gas in the shale. This shale layer, which, as I said, is relatively narrow, is located more than a mile below the Earth's surface. Now, we all have heard about hydraulic fracturing. This is a process of injecting fluid into these naturally occurring fissures in rocks or fissures that have been created by explosives also, which we'll talk about later. And it's only one step in the process of unconventional gas extraction. And we always hear from people when we bring up any health concerns related to hydraulic fracturing that, well, this has been going on for 80 years, and we haven't seen any problems, so how could there possibly be any problems? And it is true that hydraulic fracturing has been used previously in conventional gas extraction, but it's really a whole different kettle of fish, as they would say. It's a whole different process. In order to economically produce natural gas from the Marcellus Shale or other shale formations, it required the development of more intensive hydraulic fracturing as well as other industrial-type techniques. We're going to talk about these four: directional drilling, high volume, high fluid, high volume, high pressure hydraulic fracturing, the addition of chemicals to the water that's used in fracking. This is often called slick water, and there are a whole number of chemicals that are added for different purposes throughout the course of the hydraulic fracturing process. And then the concept of multi-well sites as compared to the conventional where you have a single well on a pad, not multiple wells. So directional drilling is illustrated in this slide. The drill first goes down vertically, and then in order to take advantage of the gas that is distributed throughout the shale, the drilling goes off in a horizontal fashion, and that can be for 1 or 2 miles. And with regards to the fluid volumes used in unconventional gas extraction versus conventional gas extraction, we're really talking about more than 100 times as much fluid is used per well. And the pressures are much higher, 3 to 5 times higher than might be used in conventional gas extraction. Now, I don't intend with this slide that you are going to learn all of the different kinds of additives, their purposes, or the chemical examples. But the slide is supposed to give you an idea of the magnitude and diversity of the types of additives that go into hydraulic fracturing fluid. And the one with the greatest volume is what they call proppants, which is primarily sand, which is used to prop open those fissures that the gas is coming out of. And you probably are familiar with slides similar to this that show that while most of hydraulic fracturing fluid is water, so 90% is water, another 9% is the proppant, the sand, usually sand, And another 0.5 to 1%, which seems like just a small amount, is made up of all these chemicals. But if you consider 1% of 5 million gallons, you're talking 50,000 gallons of chemicals going into the earth with each time a well is fracked, and a well can be fracked more than one time. Just to give you the concept of what a multi-well pad is, and the idea of this is that you have one well that drills down and then drills horizontally for 1 to 2 miles, and then a little bit further along you have another one that drills down and then drills in a parallel fashion for 1 to 2 miles, and then you have wells that are going the opposite direction. So from one well pad, you can cover, the horizontal drilling is covering miles of the shale. The purpose of this slide is to indicate that although hydraulic fracturing has occurred in the past, that it's really been only in the past 10 years that the types of technologies that we use nowadays for hydraulic fracturing have been developed and utilized. And most recently, you see, it wasn't until 2007 that we had these multi-well pads used for shale drilling. And the source of this is from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, their supplemental generic environmental impact statement. So this is a sort of animated step-by-step process in hydraulic fracturing that is from the New York Times. So this shows the start of drilling and how the drill bit goes down, it penetrates the water table, and then there is both a steel casing and then around the steel casing, a cement casing. So when people talk about leaks in well casing, that's what they're talking about. But it's also important to see that you actually drill through the aquifer before there's any protective casing put into place. So that's a potential time for contamination of the aquifer with the what's called drilling mud, as well as bacterial contamination of the aquifer. And then you see that the drill went down, hit the shale, and then started drilling in a horizontal fashion. And again, there's steel pipe and cement put in place. And then they use explosives to both augment the existing fissures and also creates new fissures. So you have to have, if you're going to frack this, you have to have holes in the steel case. You can't just put water in a steel pipe and expect it to come out. And then you see the pressurized water. That's the actual hydrofracking moment. The water flows back after you release the pressure, and varying amounts of this water or flowback fluid comes back to the surface, bringing, as Cian mentioned previously, other substances from below ground, such as the salts, the brines, heavy metals, organic materials, and naturally occurring radioactive materials. Gas starts flowing, and the next picture is a close-up of sand grains holding these small fissures open. That's what all the sand is for, is to prop open these fissures. And we're going to talk briefly about each of these steps in gas extraction. Seismic testing, which is something I wasn't even aware of until recently, is it's used to characterize the geological formations that are below the area that drilling is being considered for, and they dig holes that are 20 feet deep, and they put dynamite charges in them. They explode the dynamite charges, and they have sensors. This is a picture of a sensor that's on the surface, and the sensor measures the shock waves that are generated and gets a sort of picture of the geologic formations below. And even this process has been associated with some disruption of residential wells. Then you see a pad construction that's typically requires clearing 4 to 6 acres of land and building plastic-lined pits, sometimes for water and other times also for containment of the flowback fluid. This is a picture when they're actually drilling the well. And this is an actual site undergoing hydraulic fracturing. And I was astounded by this picture, by the amount of traffic. And people know about my fears of driving and parallel parking and even backing up. You can see why this would be like a nightmare to me. But the other thing that struck me with this photo was about why, when NIOSH was first investigating hydraulic fracturing, their primary concerns, they were looking at health and safety concerns, but their primary concerns were safety related to moving equipment around the well pads, because there were injuries and deaths which resulted from that, and you can see how easily that could happen. The other thing you may not be able to see or appreciate on this picture, but there is a sort of haze over the picture, and that's from all the sand that's being used. And we talked about the equivalent really of 500,000 gallons of sand, though you don't necessarily measure sand in gallons, but huge amounts of sand that are being used. And that has led to NIOSH's now primary concern, which they have published on, of silica exposure, so the risks of silicosis for the workers at these sites. Now the next step is, once it's been fracked, you have to deal with the flowback fluid. And as we said, that's the fluid that comes back from underground, containing both the chemicals from the hydraulic fracturing, but also the salts, the heavy metals, organic chemicals, and radioactive material that is brought up from underground. And this material is typically either stored on site to allow some of it to evaporate, or trucked off to processing facilities. And there's, of course, been a lot written about the inadequacy of the processing facilities for dealing with the chemicals in the fluid. It is sometimes now recycled and used in other wells. After the gas starts being produced, wells are often flared, and that's I'm uncertain of all the reasons they do this, but one of the reasons they do this is to test the initial production of the well. But it is obviously a source of air pollution to individuals living in the area, and there have been fires that have resulted from the flaring. So once the gas is produced, it needs to be processed and it needs to be transported. These are photos of on-site condensate tanks that remove some of the water and impurities from the gas. And then the gas is typically piped off to sort of local compressor stations where there is further purification and compression. And these compressor stations can also be sources of emissions and air pollution. So that's really the part of the talk discussing the process of unconventional gas extraction. And we're going to move on now to speak about some of the potential sources of environmental contamination and exposure. And I'm dividing this into chemical exposures and non-chemical exposures. And under chemical exposures, I'm just focusing on air and water, but we have to keep in mind that there's also potential contamination of soil, both from surface material coming down on the soil and contamination of vegetation. You can also get contamination of soil from soil gas permeating upwards. And with regards to water, it can be both surface water and groundwater. And then the non-chemical exposures, I'm going to focus on noise and traffic. So potential sources of air contamination. Diesel exhaust is a big potential source of both sort of hydrocarbon and particulate material exposure, and it can come from either the numerous trucks that are going back and forth from the well pads, but also from the machines, the diesel-powered machines that are powering the hydrofracking and drilling activities. Then flaring, fugitive emissions, so emissions that really aren't intended but are coming off of the wellhead, coming off of the condensate tanks and the compressor stations. And these are actually some of the emissions that EPA is now looking to essentially regulate, or to have the gas industry put in best technology to reduce those emissions. And then with the impoundments, there can be either volatilization of the chemicals or evaporation, which results in air contamination. And this slide looks at the different sources of air emissions, and then the different chemicals that are coming, which are emitted. And of course, ozone is not directly emitted by these machines or by any of these processes, but ozone is formed from a combination of nitrous oxides and volatile organic chemicals in the presence of sunlight. Ozone is a strong pulmonary irritant. VOCs are volatile organic chemicals, and BTEX refers to the 4 of the chemicals that we are most concerned about their health effects, and that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. And NORMS refers to the naturally occurring radioactive materials. And this slide, just using the same format, talks about some of the known health effects of these exposures. Particulate material has, in addition to pulmonary effects, also has cardiovascular effects. Now, going from the sort of the theoretical to what has actually been measured, this is a publication a study that was recently published from Colorado, from Garfield County. And what they did was they measured hydrocarbon emissions from wells that were undergoing completion. And they had 163 measurements from a fixed monitor that was not located right adjacent to the wells, but was located in that rural community where the gas activities were occurring. And then they had 24 samples from around the well pads at distances ranging from 130 to 500 feet. And so they had all these measurements, and then they used EPA techniques to estimate both the non-cancer, which were sort of short-term effects, and then lifetime cancer risks, and compare those risks between people living less than a half a mile from the pads to those that were living more than a half a mile from the well pads. The first conclusion from this study was that residents who lived closest to the well pads have higher risks for respiratory and neurological effects based on their exposure to the air pollutants coming from the well pads. And this is on a kind of short-term or subchronic basis. And then residents living close to the natural gas wells had a higher excess lifetime risk for cancer than residents who live further from the wells. And this was a small but statistically significant effect, and it was primarily driven by the exposure to benzene. And then they also concluded that the emissions that were measured, in proximity or within 500 feet of the center of the wells were statistically much higher than the emissions measured at this fixed location in the rural area. So the significance of this is, to me, one of the significances. We do have the Department of Environmental Protection has monitors all over the state for air quality, but those may not reflect what is going on, or you don't predict that they'll reflect what's going on for residents that are far from the monitors and close to the wells. And some of the limitations of the study, besides the fact that they didn't measure all of the hydrocarbons that we know are emitted from wells. They didn't measure ozone. They didn't measure particulate materials, which are both important in terms of pulmonary health. And it's very difficult to estimate the health risks of a mixed exposure. And so these methods, the EPA methods, may have underestimated health risks of mixed exposures. Now, this slide is courtesy of Dave Brown, who's been introduced here. But this was some local measurements that were done of particulate material 1,000 feet from compressor stations in Pennsylvania. And there were different sizes of PM, like PM 2.5 he measured also, but this is the slide showing PM 0.5, which is in the range of what we see from diesel engines, and a size of particle that has respiratory toxicity associated with it. And the background levels you would anticipate would be 1,000 to 2,000 counts per cubic foot air. And you see that in these areas, in fairly close proximity to compressor station, there were peaks that far exceeded background levels. So that's just some local data. The other data we're talking about, Colorado, we don't have a huge amount of local data, but this is one study that suggests a potential problem from the compressor stations. Moving on to water contamination, some of the potential sources of water contamination. The seismic testing, we've already talked about the fact that that can disrupt wells. The initial drilling through the aquifer that occurs before there's any protective casing put in place. Failures in well casings. I mean, you look at this, pipes are going down 6,000 or 7,000 feet before they then turn horizontally, and they then have cement around them. It's easy to see how that might not happen perfectly every single time that happens. So if you have a failure either in the cement or in the metal pipe, you can get leaks. The other concern is that there actually be migration of those chemicals up through the fissures in the shale rock. And then lots of concerns about the storage and transport and processing of wastewater. And then other potential for other on-site spills or transportation spills or transportation accidents. And we have to remember that the we would think that hydraulic fracturing activities where you're injecting toxic chemicals into the ground would be regulated under the EPA Safe Drinking Water Act Underground Injection Control Program. However, hydraulic fracturing was almost entirely exempted from regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act in 2005. Now, looking at risks of water contamination, this is just one study where they, using probability theory, they tried to figure out how likely it was that there would be water contamination, and basically found out that it was highly likely that there would be water contamination from hydraulic fracturing and unconventional gas extraction. And they looked at a number of potential sources, and they determined that they felt that the primary risk had to do with the wastewater management, both the risks of spills from impoundment ponds and even to a larger extent the inadequacy of the treatment at the wastewater treatment plants. There have been studies since then that have been more concerned about the ability of chemicals to actually migrate up through the rocks, though the time frame for that remains uncertain. And this is a study I think we're all familiar with, which came out of Duke, in which they looked at methane contamination of wells, and they determined that methane does occur naturally in some wells in Pennsylvania, but they found higher levels of methane in wells that were in closer proximity to drilling activity. And a really important study on water contamination is from Pavilion, Wyoming. This is an EPA study that the results came out in the end of 2011 and the beginning of 2012. And this was after earlier studies had found contamination in wells that were drawing from the shallow aspect of the aquifers. They did some additional testing looking at putting in deep monitoring wells and found that there was also contamination of the water deep within the aquifer. And their interpretation was that the contamination that was occurring in the shallow aspects of the aquifer was from surface activities such as the leaks from storage pits, the storage pits for the flowback fluid, and that the deeper sources were actually related to gas production. And their summary was that inorganic, like salts and organic materials associated with hydraulic fracturing have contaminated the aquifer, and that the gas production activities also likely enhance the migration of methane into the water. Again, Dave Brown looked at some of the raw data from this study, and these were some of the chemicals that were most frequently found in these drinking water wells in Pavilion. And this is looking at, again, Dave looking at the levels of salt ions that were reported in the well water. So things that you wouldn't normally expect to find at that level. And the one thing about talking about inorganics versus organics, the inorganic salts are what increases what's called the conductivity or conductance in water. And measuring conductivity is one of the tools that people have to cheaply and frequently examine their own water and see if there's a change. Because it's, if you have a change in conductivity, then you suspect that there are other things also contaminating your water at that point. And this is a measurement that both we and the Penn State Extension Service recommend that people do, in between their regular testing, which is quite expensive for a large number of chemicals. And if you find a change in conductivity, then we recommend that that you then proceed with further testing. The conditions in Pavilion are quite different from the conditions in the Marcellus, but the EPA did try to extrapolate a little bit to what would happen in the Marcellus, what the implications of what they found in Pavilion were for the Marcellus shale. And they felt that the contamination in the Marcellus would be greater, that contamination from surface sources would be greater, and that's because of the greater amount of water that's used. And that contamination from deeper sources was less likely because there were fewer routes for the contaminations to rise to the aquifer. Now moving from Wyoming to Pennsylvania, these are some measures of conductance at 13 Pennsylvania drinking water wells. So there are 13 wells, but there are a lot more measurements. You would typically expect the conductance in water to be less than 500. So you can see that there are a number of measurements that are in excess of that, which suggest contamination as a result of the natural gas extraction. Now moving from the chemical to the non-chemical, I'm going to focus on noise and traffic, and there are other concerns such as light and vibration, but we're not going to talk about those today. And this is a little chart just to remind people what the decibel scale is. And if you see that 50 to 60 is really normal conversation, and that, so normal conversation doesn't sound that loud, but if somebody is having a normal conversation in your bedroom when you're trying to sleep, that could be annoying. The next few slides are going to look at estimated noise levels at various distances from a well pad during different activities. So the first one, this is, you're constructing the well pad at your 1,000 feet. You've got 58 decibels of noise, and typically with most of these processes, we're talking 24 hours a day. We're not just, it's not just daytime activity. You're 2,000 feet, living 2,000 feet away. You still have somebody having a conversation in your bedroom when you're trying to sleep, or not really, but noise level. And this is for the rotary air well drilling, which is, the levels are similar to directional drilling. Still levels of concern. And again, this is 24 hours a day. This goes on for 4 to 5 weeks. And then the highest levels actually occur with the hydraulic fracturing. I mean, this would be really annoying to have 72 decibels of noise in your house when you're trying to do anything. And of course, the sound levels for the workers are would place them at risk for noise-induced hearing loss, and they would be required to wear hearing protection, but they're still very loud noise levels. And again, this just goes to show that for drilling a single well, the site preparation takes 2 weeks, drilling a well takes about 5 weeks, and fracturing a single well for one time takes about 5 days. So this is a lot of noise going on, and it can be repeated over and over again on one well pad. So health effects of noise, we're talking about levels well into the area for noise-induced hearing loss for the workers. For the residents, sleep disturbance, there's also an association, an independent association of noise exposure and increased blood pressure. People find it difficult to perform their usual tasks when there's a lot of background noise. It's annoying, and it results in irritability. People who live, you guys who live around here, I don't have to tell you about this, but typically to frack a well once requires over 2,000 truckloads of material back and forth, which is a lot of heavy trucks. And this results in exposure such as exhaust, dust, the noise that we've already talked about. There are occasionally spills. There are other safety concerns when these trucks, for example, are driving on school routes. There are other collisions that occurred, and the heavy trucks on country roads not intended for heavy trucks results in degraded roads, which is not only an expense to repair, but it's also a safety concern for other people driving on those roads. Now, what are the actual, we've talked about theoretical health effects, but what are the actual symptoms that we've been seeing? And in this slide, I combine Denise DeJohn's patients and Dr. Saberi's. Dr. Saberi's over in Philadelphia. Denise is here. And I only included the ones of Denise's that, there are people that come in for information, or they're concerned because they're boarding their animals someplace and they're concerned about their animal health but not theirs. So I excluded those. And these are the health symptoms that individuals have associated with the onset of hydraulic fracture or the unconventional gas extraction activities. So if somebody had a rash beforehand and it wasn't changed, then I didn't include them in this slide. Or if they were having breathing difficulties at the same level, I didn't include them. But so we can see the primary symptom that we have seen is skin rash or irritation, and this commonly is something that occurs after showering and is transient. So by the time they get to the office, there's not going to be any rash to be seen. You just have to believe that this person took a shower, got a rash, or their skin got irritated, and then it went away. Breathing difficulties. So this is shortness of breath, other breathing difficulties such as worsening asthma symptoms or difficulty taking a deep breath. And then the gastrointestinal symptoms were the abdominal pain or abdominal cramping and nausea or vomiting were also frequently seen. So talking about social disruption and mental health effects, this is based on a presentation by Roxanne Witter from the Colorado School of Public Health in a workshop that she gave, that the Institute of Medicine gave. So we're talking about Garfield County, Colorado, and where they had a boom in gas drilling. And she identifies 4 potential sources of social disruption. The first was the rapid influx of new people, and the fact that the local governments had neither the jurisdiction nor the resources to deal with the problems that would be predicted to occur from this rapid population influx and to the other environmental changes that occurred. She also talks about the industry's monopoly on information, so that people, if the industry monopolizes the story, then people have difficulty understanding what's going on and making choices. And then the 4th source was just the rapid changes in the environment. And they could measure certain things with, you can't measure everything, but using sort of publicly available sources of information, and over the period where this boom occurred, they did document that there were increased rates of crime. That was measured by police arrests. They measured increased rates of sexually transmitted diseases, and that's like a public health statistic that was available. And there was an increased overall school enrollment, but with a rapid turnover of students during the school year, which you can imagine would be quite disruptive. And the reactions the community members expressed included anger, depression, anxiety, helplessness, and uncertainty about their futures. Now, moving from Colorado to Pennsylvania, Simona Perry is a PhD doing research in Bradford County. She's from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and she's been doing ongoing research since mid-2009. And some of her methods are using focus groups, interviews, and surveys. And she describes Bradford County as a rural county with deep family ties to the land. And these are actually photos that some of the members of her focus groups took to express what was important to them about where they lived. And again, these are important qualities of life that members of her focus group described. The clean water, the fresh air, the fertile soil, the rural way of life, economic security, and then in terms of the ties to the land, the fact that their family tie to the land occurred in the past, occurs in the present, and their expectation that their family tie to the land would occur in the future, would continue in the future. And she describes how the community members initially embraced the benefits of the boom. That was both to help the local economy and also because these tend to be very patriotic individuals, many of whom had either served in the military or had family members serving in the military, and there was a great desire to bring the troops home, to have the United States to be no longer dependent on foreign oil. And there was also a deep felt belief that government agencies would not be letting this drilling and gas activities occur if it were potentially harmful. And as this gas boom occurred, the initial rapid changes had to do with what we've talked about some already, the increased traffic, the congestion, accidents, damaged roads, the large influx of workers and their families. And this ended up, because they needed places to live, ended up increasing rents and then displacing local peoples. So they no longer had a place to live, and also the increased enrollment in schools. And the other thing she talked about, which wasn't mentioned in the previous study, was the fact that many city and county employees left their jobs to go work for the gas industry at higher paid jobs. So you have governments that already don't have enough resources to deal with the problems that are occurring, and then you have even fewer personnel to address those problems. And on a day-to-day basis, residents would say that the primary thing that affected their quality of life was actually the traffic, with noise being a major complaint. They also would have to change their daily routines, either because of the particular traffic flow or because certain roads were closed because they were damaged. And there was also the fear of safety when driving on roads with these big trucks. And gradually, the community members who had initially embraced the gas industry became more and more disillusioned with both the industry, but also with the agencies that they had believed would protect them. And they developed very acrimonious divisions within the community between those people who continued to support the industry and those who had become disillusioned. And these are almost quotes from the members of her focus groups, that the emotions that they expressed for the long term were the concerns that the gas boom had irreversibly changed their relationship to the land, past, present, and future, and a sense of dread that all that they loved most was being taken away. And Dr. Perry's, we have a link to her in our resources to a talk she gave at the University of Pittsburgh last fall, and she has some really thought-provoking ideas, and I think it would be, if you get a chance, it would be interesting to look at that presentation. Now, in our questionnaire at the Environmental Health Project, we also ask about emotions related to unconventional gas extraction. And again, I only included emotions that occurred after the gas extraction activities began. And the primary emotional problems that people have expressed to us were depression, worry, irritability, and feeling overwhelmed. So in conclusion, both chemical and non-chemical exposures produced by gas drilling activities pose health risks to the residents living in the gas production areas. In addition, the rapid changes resulting from introduction of gas drilling activities into rural communities carries risk of social disruption and mental health consequences. Thank you.